Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and aw shoot, here we go again. We've got another Marchesa, the Black Rose deck from Kybor, but here's the secret. It's the Nazgûl deck we were talking about yesterday. Marchesa, the Black Rose Nazgûl. Kybor, thank you for supporting the channel again. And you say I've cursed you. I don't know. I'm so excited to see this deck. This is so wonderful. It's already basically everything I wanted it to be. So a lot of this deck assist video will be mainly just talking about the deck, and then I have like a handful of suggestions. And already I think the deck is amazing and mostly complete. So we're going to be very nitpicky here, and I think we're going to have a good time doing it. Let me, before I get any further, read Kybor's message. After seeing your Marchesa video, I got so interested in putting together a deck with her in the Nazgul and came up with this after a couple hours. Obviously, the idea is to sack Nazgul, preferably doing so at instant speed on everyone's turn, so I can keep bringing them back and getting those ring tempting buffs. Mostly looking to see if draw and sacrifice package looks good, but feel free to give me any ideas you think are good, such as if you think the deck would benefit with more ways to give other creatures +1/+1 counters, or something I didn't consider. And no restrictions. My goodness, if this is like a first draft within an hour, it's so good. This is such a well-built deck. I'm really, really impressed. And there will be some points that we can kind of prod at it, but a lot of the decisions we're going to make are going to adjust, let's say, how do I put this? If we're going to be adjusting its birth, BERTH, as in like, a deck can sway into several kind of directions, even when it's complete, right? You may adjust a deck to be a little more controlly. You may adjust a deck to be a little less controlly, for example. Whereas it's still going to be basically the same deck. And there's a few additions that I want to put in to make it more Nazgûl-y, but like even those don't feel necessary. This deck is already very well set up. Before we get into this, as always, if you'd like to submit your own deck, you can check the video description below to find a link so you can submit your own deck. I know someone recently was talking about wanting to build another, was looking at Marchesa the Black Rose and hoping to build them into this current, EDH format. And I think this is just proof that it's absolutely still doable, with even fresh new ideas and new kind of mechanics that we wouldn't have had. Nazgûl were just printed. So even a commander from so long ago, a fresh breath of air really, really changes what she can do. And if you make a deck like that, submit it to me. We can take a look. There's also a link there if you'd like to bring your deck to the front of the list like Kybor did. Once again, Kybor, thank you for supporting the channel so much. I'm so grateful for it, and I love that I get to look at a deck like this. So let's zoom through the the first few things we always have to do, because let's get into the meat of it as fast as we can. First and foremost, Marchesa the Black Rose. We know what she does, but let's repeat it. She's a 4-mana Grixis 3/3 commander with Dethrone that gives other creatures Dethrone. Dethrone makes it so that when you attack, creatures with the Dethrone attack opponents that have the most life among all players, they will gain a +1/+1 counter. This is really, really good in general kind of, evasive creatures, general kind of beatdown strategies, and a bit of politics with life totals. The only problem that usually exists is that this counts all players, unlike a commander like Brina. This doesn't, this counts yourself too. So if you get too far into the lead, Dethrone no longer triggers. Now this deck isn't very reliant on Dethrone. Almost half of the creatures in our deck come with a +1/+1 counter already. So Dethrone is kind of a side note, so we don't have to worry about too much, but it still can be relevant. And then, as always, Marchesa's real important ability is that whenever our creature dies, if it has a +1/+1 counter, it will be reanimated on the end step. Now, something important to kind of note here that I didn't note last time, for those who might be newer to the deck or not quite familiar with all the intricacies of Magic, This means if you have Marchesa and let's say, you know, 3 Nazgûl, and the Nazgûl have +1/+1 counters and Marchesa doesn't, if someone wraths the board, does a board clear, you still get the Nazgûl back, right? Marchesa still sees them die, which means if people want you to, you know, to lose the Nazgûl permanently, they need to destroy Marchesa first, wait till, wait till either because if she has a +1 counter, she will reanimate herself. But when she's off the board, then you can destroy the Nazgul and they won't come back. But even then, that's a lot of effort and a lot of cards. Meanwhile, this deck already has a lot of means to, you know, get around that or make up for that. All right, looking down, let's see what our curve is like. Our curve is beautiful. I love it so much. It's very, very clean, very early casts, very strong cards, very low amount of cards in the 4-drop, all of which are cards that I 100% agree with. Albeit Yawgmoth does feel like the weakest of the group because his primary function is to be a sacrifice outlet. And though he is also card draw, he is really there as a sacrifice outlet. And when we compare it to him to the other sacrifice outlets in the deck, he is technically weaker because he is 4 mana to get onto the board. 4 mana is the same as our commander. However, the fact that we draw a card on sacrifice makes it, you know, it's a much stronger version of like Viserys here, which is just scry, or even Phyrexian or Ashnod's Altar, which makes mana. Sometimes drawing cards is just more valuable than those effects. And if you can't use the mana on your opponent's turn when you sacrifice a Nazgul, you are kind of wasting that ability, whereas Yawgmoth always gets you the one. So you know though it is the weakest of the 4-drops, it is still a very good card. So I just wanted to bring some attention to that. Let's look at the deck itself. The deck itself is just really, really nice. We've got a lot of early sacrifice cards. Scorn Blade Berserker is really, really good, and I can't believe I hadn't thought of it. The fact that she puts a +1/+1 counter on something, the fact that she allows that thing to immediately be sacrificed for 1 mana, therefore bringing it back into play at the end of turn with Marchesa, is really, really cool. I do really like it. So I do. I also really love the art of this lady with a giant, giant axe, and she's a 0/1. I'm not quite sure what's going on with that, but she's also beheading Saurulf, which is also, this is such a cool card. I wonder if prior to maybe there was some change in power and toughness because a 0/1 doesn't feel like what this card's supposed to be. But if that was the exchange of making her 1 mana, this is an exchange I'm very, very willing to take. She's a very, very good card. Viserys Seer is very good here, just like Carrion Feeder, another sack outlet. Baleful Strix feels a little weaker here. The evasion on it allows us to put the +1/+1 counter with Dethrone, and after which what we can do is, you know, every time it is reanimated, we still get that ETB, which isn't bad. But all things considered, it is a little weaker because it doesn't center. It's more like a generically good card in a deck that is very, very hyper focused on a strategy. So it is a bit of an outlier. However, the floor on Baleful Strix is pretty high, so I don't see that bad as an inclusion. We have Crashing Drawbridge and over here Mass Hysteria for haste. Really, really do like haste in a deck like this because if you can play multiple Nazgul in one turn and have them have haste, you are going to be taking opponents out. And to the point that I wonder if a trample enabler is somewhat necessary, and we have some evasion here and there, so we'll get to that when we get to that. Dockside Extortionists, for a number of reasons, incredibly strong. That is making me think of a card we should be including. So let me just put that to the side. Perfect. And we'll get back to that in a second. But Dockside Extortionist is really, really good. If we can throw a counter on it, it gets really, really ridiculous how many times we can just put it into play, get more and more treasures, and it is by itself just such a good win condition in a deck like this. Braids, really interesting. I really like Braids here. I think I think Braids is tricky here. I really, really like her, but she's close to being maybe not ideal. And why I'm saying this is that I feel like more there's going to be a lot of scenarios where you have braids and you don't have the best sacrifices at the moment. What do I mean by that? I mean two things. The first thing I mean is braids is really, really good when you have your commander out and you have a creature with a +1/+1 on it. So when you are already doing the thing your deck wants to do, braids is really, really strong. So when you're ahead, braids is strong. When you're behind, not so much. You don't have a lot of creatures to sacrifice or a lot of artifacts to sacrifice. Which brings me to the second point I wanted to make. Braid's Arisen Nightmare is traditionally stronger when we have, how do I put this? When we have non-creature permanents to sacrifice. Creatures are kind of the cheapest thing to have and the cheapest thing to sacrifice. And only players with the perfect board will not sacrifice creatures and let you instead draw the card. Now, there is a perk to that. You might be like, okay, so they don't sacrifice any creatures. I'm going to get the card draw, and I guess they lose 2 life. That's a good trade. But often in those times, you really do want them to sacrifice something, right? Whereas Whereas if you use a non-creature permanent, namely, I think of treasure tokens, clue tokens, any form of artifact token is often the easiest thing to do after creatures. Once you sacrifice one of those cards, or like a mana rock you don't use anymore, there's a higher chance that your opponents don't have artifacts, and you're guaranteeing the card draw. That's usually the way you want to play Braids. Now, you could also suggest that Braids is a tertiary stack outlet, where once again, when you have Marchesa, when you have a creature with a +1/+1 counter, if you don't have a sack outlet, you're using Braids not for her effect, but for the fact that she'll sacrifice a Nazgûl, bring it back, and buff your Nazgûl team. And to that, once again, I'm like, okay, yeah, but Carrion Feeder, Viscera Seer, my goodness, and a number of other, and the altars probably do a better job at that. So I'm medium on her. I really, really like Braids, and there's a lot of decks that she just does so well in, and I don't know if this setup is exactly the one we want. So I'm just gonna put that's my point on this. Fleshbag Marauder and Plague Crafter also stand out. The synergy here can be really, really strong, right? Now, do we have cards that when they enter the battlefield give them +1/+1 counters? And I don't. We have Uncivil Unrest, and I think that's it. And I might suggest another one in the deck, but at the moment, I'm pretty sure we don't have the means for these creatures to come in with +1/+1 counters. So don't get me wrong, with Uncivil Unrest, it's really good because you play it, sacrifice it, everyone sacrifices a creature, turn cycle goes around, it goes back into play on the next end step, sacrifice it, so on and so forth. Every turn, you're edicting your opponent. But considering this is such a specific combo of those two cards, I think what I would prefer is to cut one of them. I don't think you want both. And there is a situation you play like Fleshbag Marauder and you sack Baleful Strix with a +1/+1 counter. And that does feel good. But once again, we have so many better sack outlets. So I would cut Fleshbag Marauder because Playcrafter is the stronger version. I would cut Fleshbag Marauder and then see how often Playcrafter is good. Because Playcrafter can be very, very good, but sometimes it just feels like it belongs in a different deck. As I've said before in a lot of aristocrat strategies or a lot of black sacrifice strategies, is these kind of effects, these innocent blood effects, are really, really good in multiples. Every subsequent innocent blood effect or playcrafter effect gets better and better because you are taxing your opponent's creatures over and over again. And the thing is once again, we might say, hey, but Curse, Plaguecrafter and Uncivil Unrest do that exactly, but only together do they do that exactly, right? Otherwise, you have to play Plaguecrafter, you have to sacrifice something else, you have to wait a turn cycle, You have to attack with Playcrafter in a way to give it a +1/+1 counter, and then you sacrifice the Playcrafter, and then next and the end step you get like that's a lot of hoops to jump through, right? And that's assuming there's no interaction against Marchesa or anything like that. So with that in mind, I think playing the one of Playcrafter is fine, hoping for the combo, but otherwise I think it's just kind of okay. Spark Double, Spark Double's fine. It's so good, so great. Nothing more to say, right? It has an interesting. There is an interesting thing, and I will come back to this. That Spark Double actually is a little weaker in this deck than in the previous Marchesa deck that we looked at. And the reason is that one of the ideal targets for this is the Nazgûl. Because weirdly enough, spark doubling our Marchesa is actually not very good, right? It's fine. She's no longer legendary, so you get two Marchesas, but her effect doesn't stack, right? So I guess your creatures get double dethroned, but even then, like I don't think it's worth it. So what are you copying? Because it has to be your creature, right? Well, the answer is, right, the Nazgul. But one of the big perks of Spark Double in other Marchesa decks is that Spark Double comes with the +1/+1 counter, whereas the Nazgul already come with a +1/+1 counter. It's just kind of funny. I'm not suggesting that we don't play it because it's still very strong. Works really, really well with like Winged Hive Tyrant. Works really well with Dockside Extortionist. But even then, it's just kind of strange that this setup kind of, how do we put this? It kind of undoes the strength of this card a little bit. Uh, Not a bad thing, but just interesting, right? All right, we talked about Yawgmoth already. We talked so Urabrask is interesting. I feel like there might be better choices. I really do like Urabrask the Hidden. He is my favorite Praetor, I think, and this card is just always feels like so close to being good, but not really often there. The fact it gives all our creatures haste, really, really nice. The fact that it keeps our opponent's creatures tapped, also nice. I just feel to an extent it's like, is there a better version of evasion that we can give? Because that's mainly what I'm looking for. We have better haste enablers, and so I'm really looking at the other half that makes our opponent's creatures come in tapped. And I feel like I don't know if this is the best thing here. Whereas maybe we should be looking for something else here. Winged Hive Tyrant, in a lot of ways, is like what I perceive to be the better version of this, where it's flying haste 4/4, already a very, very good body. And then other creatures you control with counters on them have flying and haste. So you get the evasion, you get the haste. This just feels like better Urabrask. So though redundancy is good, I don't know if Urabrask is doing the redundancy that it should be doing, and instead we can find a better card. Off the top of my head, I don't know what a better card is. That's why I'm not going to say right away just cut Urabrask. But I feel like there has to be something that we're not thinking of that could fit into that slot. Going to our sorceries, diabolic intent is good here. I am a little concerned that there's going to be situations where you only have Nazgûls and no Marchesas, and that Diabolic Intent is going to feel really, really bad. It's unlikely, but it's possible. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but at this point, if you have a Diabolic Tutor instead, it might just be more reliable, and then I would play Diabolic Intent second after the Tutor. Just because this is one of those decks that your creatures are really, really important to you, and you don't make a lot of tokens that you I don't think you make any token creatures at all, actually. So this is not the ideal situation for intent. When you do have just like a baleful Strix that you don't mind losing, it's really, really good, but otherwise might not be ideal. Feed the Swarm, really good here. Obviously, Rest in Peace really, really hurts you. Having Feed the Swarm is really nice. Just Guy's Will, just a very, very good card. And Blasphemous Act, likewise. Going through our instance, once again, really nice. I can't even begin to tell you how cool Mask of the Mimic is right here. I am so impressed that you thought of this card with Nazgul. This is phenomenal. A card that is universally bad in Commander is now really, really good in this deck. I love it so much. This is such a good inclusion. considering that you sacrifice the Nazgul, Nazgul comes back, then you get another Nazgul in play. Ah, it's so, so good. Our regular kind of collection of Feigned Death effects, Village Rites, Arcane Denial, our counter spells, we'll come back to those in a second. I just want to go through the rest. Nasty End, I think, is very, very good. Obviously, for those who don't know, when you make something your ring bearer, it is legendary. So Nasty End is almost universally going to draw you 3 cards for 2, which is a pretty good rate. And assuming that it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you will get the creature, the ring bearer back, let's say. The rest of these are really nice. Saw in Half, of course, as usual, is hilarious in a Nazgul deck. So coming back here, Counterspell and Mana Drain kind of stand out. The reason is this: our deck is extremely proactive, and I don't know how often we're going to have 2 mana up, right? I think often we're going to want to have the 1 mana up because it lets us have a lot of these cards. But if we look at it, like almost all of these spells, a lot of our spells here are free. Otherwise, the most of our instant spells are really, really low mana. So holding up 2 blue in a deck that blue is the least used color feels a bit tough. I'm not going to say take them out. I'm going to say think about them. Play the deck a bunch of times. See how often that you have the extra 2 blue to do something with it because it's close. I am the kind of player, we'll go on a bit of a tangent here. I said this a long, long time ago, early in the channel thing, but all right. Counter spells in Commander. So counter spells are particularly kind of nebulous in Commander because you have 3 opponents and counter spells are almost universally 1-for-1s. And so if you keep counter spelling your opponent's cards, you're going to lose in the long run. So you have to keep them for high priority targets, and oftentimes it's much more valuable to protect your own cards than it is to mess with your opponent's cards and like stop their plan unless you're like, they're about to win. Sorry, just reminding myself of another card I want to suggest. So if you can stop them from getting the win, they're really good, but otherwise they're touch and go. Now, one of the really, really strong parts of counter spells is they provide soft power. And the soft power is this. When your opponents know you're playing counter spells, let's say you're in blue-white and you constantly leave all your mana open, you're either playing Flash or kind of some kind of Shorikai control deck, your opponents have to kind of adapt to the fact that they need to really think about their spells. They need to talk to you. When I'm playing against a blue deck and they have a lot of mana and I need to do something, I will talk to my opponent and be like, "Hey, do you have a counter spell?" See what they say, and talk about, "Hey, I need to get this through," or like, "I want to stop player B from doing what they want. Will you help me encounter if they interfere?" It becomes a conversation, and what those conversations do is they give a lot of power to the opponent that has blue mana open because they can, to an extent, you know, manipulate the truth. There's a lot of situations when you're in blue, you could have 2 counters, you could have 3 counters. And if someone says, "Hey, do you have a counter spell?" you answer with maybe, you know, maybe you'll help them. The fact that you may or may not have counter spells doesn't really matter a lot of the time. But the more your opponents are worried about counterspells, the stronger the effect comes. Here, it's not that much. We have Swan Song, which is a protection spell, Arcane Denial, which is a use it on the most important spells kind of cards because it does give both you and your opponent an extra. It cycles itself and it gives your opponent an extra card, so it is on the long term kind of bad for you. And Mana Drain, which provides a ton of colorless mana, which your deck isn't that interested in using most of the time. You have a lot of really good spells that are low on colorless mana. So if you don't have the right spells, you can't use you don't have like a mana sink, right? So with that in mind, Mana Drain at least stands out to me as one I don't want, and Counterspell is okay. You're never going to scare people out of casting spells with this few counterspells. They're never going to be thinking about you having a counterspell. And Swan Song is really good when they don't expect it, but Counterspell is really, really bad when they don't expect it. Because otherwise you're holding up 2 blue forever, and you might get lucky and pick something, but otherwise there's no soft power there. Okay, that tangent kind of went in circles, I'm realizing now, but the whole idea of it is that I don't know how good reactive counter spells, or no, let's say them like the counter spells that are more generic than Swan Song, because Swan Song is a protection spell, counter spell is a literal counter spell, it counters everything. So I don't know their strength in a deck like this, so I'm a little suspicious. Moving on, after all that, let's move on to artifacts. I think the artifacts are really, really nice. The inclusion of both the greaves and the swiftfoot boots, the altars, the boots and the altars are nice. Mind Stone, I don't know if you need Mind Stone. You have a lot of rocks, and Mind Stone stands out as the weakest one. You were talking about card draw, which we will get into a second, but I don't really know to what degree you do need Mind Stone. So I'm not gonna. I think this is the weakest artifact in the deck, but otherwise the deck is very, very nice. Let's go to enchantments. Mass Hysteria, Mystic Remora, Call of the Ring. All of these, I don't even need to say them. They're all really good. Betrayal is really interesting because I assume you've put it in there because I've suggested it recently in the last Marchesa deck, and it's still really good here. But because that deck had more of a steal your opponent's creatures sub theme, whereas this deck doesn't have it at all, so it's good to have at least one card that uses this. This is less proactively on theme for us. Nazgûl are our main beat sticks and are very powerful. So it's funny because I'm going to actually say if it's between the ones that we suggested in our last video, Grave Betrayal may not be as good as Insurrection there. Because Insurrection is actually kind of stronger in this deck because you are always managing to have a very strong board, and Insurrection allows you to clear out all blockers from all opponents. You'll still have the ability to steal a bunch of these creatures after dethrone triggers, ideally, but Insurrection taking care of all of your opponent's blockers lets your Nazgul come in, and when your Nazgul hit, you tend to win the game. So Grave Betrayal is still very strong, but I would actually give a thought to Insurrection as well in this deck. Kind of weird, huh? And I think this is the beauty of deck building, where we have the same commander right after each other, and one card that I'm suggesting for one, and one is replaced with the other one, and then in the next deck, I'm doing the opposite movement because cards don't just belong 100% of the time. You have to look at the deck around it and find how it works. All right, that's going through the list. I want to before I go any further, just really once again have a. I want to have a moment. This deck is so fun. I really, really like how the setup is. And if you just pick this up, this list, I think you would find a lot of success with it. I think you'd have a lot of fun summoning Nazgul. I think you'd have a lot of fun reanimating the Nazgul. And right now, I'm going to do this. So I'm assuming when you clicked on this video, I'm going to name this as the Nazgul deck because I think right now in my mind, this is the ideal Nazgul deck. It works so well with how they work just naturally that I think 100% this is the one I would play if I was playing Nazgul. So with that in mind, a few suggestions I have are to go a little further with the Nazgul theme. So the first thing I want to say is I want to play a one mana Nazgul, which is Changeling Outcast. This is probably a weaker suggestion, but it is worth considering the fact that the Nazgul really do increase the power of every single Wraith, right? By tremendous numbers. When you think about the math that if you have this creature out, and then let's say you have Changeling Outcast out, and you have two other Nazguls come into play. So the first Nazgul comes into play, Changeling Outcast becomes a 2/2. And then the second Nazgul comes into play, they both trigger, and now it's a 4/4. That's very, like, by just doing your game plan, you have a 4/4 unblockable creature right off the bat. That's not including any dethrone that you're using, because dethrone is exceptionally easy to trigger, with the outcast because it is unblockable. Then, hypothetically, you start reanimating the ring wraiths, or you start playing more. Changing Outcast is going to go, I believe, if we think about it as every single time one comes in, you get a +1/+1 counter for each Nazgul, right? I think the real part that it gets really dumb is that if you can put two Nazgul into play at the same time and they see each other, But regardless, every time you play a subsequent Nazgul, so it goes to 7 at the third Nazgul, it goes to 11 the next one. Like it just gets big really, really fast. And the fact that it's just a very big beater very quickly, I do like it. With Dethrone, with the Nazgul, it's gonna come back because it's almost guaranteed to have a +1/+1 counter, and it's gonna just permanently be a very, very strong threat on the board. So I do like Changeling Outcast, but it is a bit weaker than the other options. Phantasmal Image is a 2 mana clone effect that on the flip side, its downside is that it is an illusion and will shatter when touched. With that in mind, I still think this is really, really good. As with all of our clone effects, when they come into play, it'll come into play with a +1/+1 counter as long as it copies the Nazgul, which means when it dies, because once again, you poke it and it dies, that's fine. Marchesa will see that, the phantasmal image will come back, be another ring wraith, trigger all your ring wraiths again, and everything will keep growing regularly. Its downside really isn't a downside, and a 2 mana Nazgul is really strong. That being said, don't forget, if the Nazgul's not out, it does not do anything. So keep that in mind. It's not ideal, but a lot of the time, this is going to be very, very strong. Remember, the floor of this card is that you can copy your opponent's creatures as well. So you can turn this into a Dark Confidant. You can turn this into, what were we just saying? There are Goblin, or Dockside Extortionist, or a number of other cards that you'd be very happy having in play. So the floor of Phantasmal Image in this deck is very, very high, and I think it's a very clean, inclusion here. So I had this here, but I'm not so sure how I feel about it. Metallic Mimic tends to do very well in this kind of deck because it gives everything else a +1/+1 counter, which Marchesa needs. But the Wraiths themselves already, all the Nazgul already come with +1/+1 counters. So maybe it's not as good. It can this card gets better the more generic Wraiths you put into the deck. And with that in mind, right now I don't think it's very strong. But if you were to think of, and we should to an extent do this now. I've been putting this off. So let's type in Wraith and let's put in our colors, and let's see how many wraiths we're missing. And thank goodness there's not too many. Street Wraith, of course, is a wraith. Lord of the Nazgul, not really that good. Ring Wraiths, when the ring, that's fine. I don't think it's particularly good. We want ones that the ring tempts you. And I feel like, yeah, I feel like they're not very, very good, unfortunately. So the next step would be to look at all the shapeshifters or the changelings in these colors, but I think this is more than enough. Let me read these one more time because these have evasion, and that's what I kind of like. Wraiths have protection from ring bearers. That doesn't mean anything. Lord of the Nazgul is the only one that I think I would consider. So this says whenever you cast an instance or sorcery spell, you get a 3/3 Wraith with Menace, and then you have 9 or more Wraiths. All your Wraiths become base power 9/9s. And I think that's really reasonable in this deck. I think you can make that happen. Now, you're not playing a lot of instants and sorceries, but you are playing like a fifth of your deck, which I think is enough to occasionally trigger Lord of the Nazgul. I think it's just another Wraith that can grow really, really quickly. And for that reason, I think it's fine. I'll leave this up to you. I think it's kind of neat. Its its ability to for you to get to 9 wraiths isn't impossible because you have the 9 Nazgul, then you have clone effects. I think the ability to get all of them is good, but it's neither here nor there. I'll leave that to you to decide. But I think it's the only other wraith that I would consider. So with that in mind, if I was playing that and I was really interested, maybe I would play the Mimic, but I don't know if I would do that as well or as strongly. So that's up to you to consider. All right, a few other clone effects. Cursed Mirror. Cursed Mirror is interesting because it is kind of a bad mana rock, but when it enters the battlefield, it comes in as a creature for the turn. This is a card I've been thinking about a lot. It's always on the back of my mind when I am thinking about artifact decks, red decks, and just mana rocks in general. Because basically, what this is it's almost like a fire diamond, right? Fire diamond taps for 1 red and comes in tapped. Now, this doesn't come in tapped, but you have to think of the sense that you're not really using it for its mana the first turn, which is like fire diamond. Okay, so it's fire diamond, but it costs 1 more, you say. Well, would you pay 1 more on fire diamond if it would come in as a copy of any creature and gain haste just for the turn? And I think my answer would be yes, right? I think that is a really, really big benefit. Now, what's also kind of cool about this is that, so this comes in as a ring wraith, you get the trigger, and it gets to attack right away. I think already that's pretty strong, and then it's a mana rock for the rest of the game. However, what's interesting is if it comes in as a ring wraith, you attack with it, and you sacrifice it, and it dies, you get to, and you have Marchesa out, you get to continue doing the loop, right? So let's say you have Viscera Seer, you have Cursed Mirror, you have a Ring Wraith in play, and you have Marchesa, and you have this Cursed Mirror. You play the Cursed Mirror, it comes in as a Ring Wraith, you attack someone with it, or both your Ring Wraiths that are stronger now. Then it goes to the end step where this creature is going to stop becoming, this will return to just being a rock and stop being a creature. You sacrifice it with Viscera Seer. Damn it, I said it correctly the first time, and I messed it up the second time. You sacrifice this creature, it leaves play, Marchesa sees a creature dying with a +1/+1 counter, end step, it returns. Now, on end step, it's going to come into play. So this is interesting, and I do have to actually figure this out. So, because this is an end of turn effect. So it's not like it's not the next end of turn. So when it comes back at the end step, I don't know if it immediately stops being a creature or if another end step needs to be triggered. I think it's another end step. Okay, someone will have to figure this out, or you'll have to ask someone smarter than me. But the way I think it is this: when you're in your cleanup step, or your end phase, all of the things that stop are going to stop at that point. And so if you set up something so there needs to be another cleanup step, there will be just another cleanup step after. However, if you sacrifice this and Marchesa's trigger, because Marchesa's trigger is the next end step, so if you sacrifice this during the end step, after it comes in, becomes a creature, and is waiting for the next cleanup step to stop being a creature, it should come back on the next end step, and you should be able to do that again. I'm not sure. It feels a little tricky, but if it works that way, it works really well with the Nazgûl. If it doesn't work that way, it's just a 3 mana clone effect, which is somewhat playable in a Nazgûl shell. So all that to say, I don't know, but it's close. Phyrexian Metamorph, once again, much like our 2 mana clone effect, this is a 3 mana clone effect. The floor is really, really high. The fact that it comes in and is a Nazgûl can be really, really good, really fun, fantastic. Here is an interesting one. This is Pirated Copy, which is a very funny name. So I want to before we go into this, I want to say I'm introducing a lot of clone creatures. I don't think you need to play them all. You don't want this deck to be too much of a clone thing, but some of these are cool and I would consider them. Pirated Copy is one of the cool ones. So it enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it's a pirate in addition to its other types. And it says whenever this creature or another creature with the same name deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Now this was made for, this is Jumpstart, weirdly enough. And this is one of those nebulous Jumpstart cards that usually is not good in Commander. In Commander, what this is intended to do is you pick one of your opponent's cards, and then whenever that card deals damage, or your copy deals damage, you draw a card. However, you have 9 copies of a card in your deck, which is not usual for Commander. So when this 5 mana Nazgûl comes into play, and then you attack your opponents, each of those Nazgûls draw you a card when they hit. And I think that's really, really cool. I don't know how good this is going to be. This could be really good, and this could be a 5 mana card that does nothing. The fact that if you copy the Nazgul, it comes in with a +1/+1 counter, and then if it dies, once again, it'll come back at the end of turn, is really, really good. So I think it makes up for the fact that it is a 5 mana copy spell. I don't know. This is like it's got my attention, is what I'm gonna say. I think it's really, really cool and can like swing you really, really far ahead. And once again, the floor is you copy someone else's really good creature with this. So I do really like this card. I think I think if I'm playing these, I think I play Phantasmal Image and Pirated Copy first, and then Metamorph third, and so on from there. So Pirated Copy really interesting. I do have one more here. I don't know how I feel about it. Mirror Mockery is for 2 mana. You enchant a creature, and when it attacks, you create a token copy of it. I think this one's interesting because it won't trigger. It won't trigger Marchesa because it is a token, so it can't come back from the graveyard. But the fact that it's tapped and attacking already. Wait, hold on. Okay, this doesn't do what I thought it does. It is not attacking. Interesting. I guess it's a red. It's because it's blue and not red. I assumed you could attack with it right away, but I think this is also meant to enchant your opponent's creatures so you get copies of it. Okay, I don't like that as much. It's interesting, but like, so it's 2 mana, you attach it to a Wraith, to your Nazgul, you attack with a Nazgul, you get an extra Nazgul trigger. That's basically it, right? It exiles, it doesn't even die, so it doesn't even trigger death triggers, but you can use Yawgmoth to draw a card off of it if you would like. That's interesting. I just is that worth it? Is 2 mana like how many times would you have to attack with that Nazgul for this to be worth it? And I would say probably at least twice. You cast this on a Ring Wraith, you attack with it, you wait a turn cycle, you hopefully still have that Ring Wraith, you attack with it again, you get a second Nazgul. I think that's good. I think that's good enough. I'll leave this to you to decide. This is a really interesting card that works in a really, really weird way. Once again, really only works in a Nazgul deck. And I think that's something worth saying is there's a lot of cards here that we don't really expect to be good in other decks because you don't have Nazgul decks recently. Commander doesn't have a lot of cards that have the same name. So a lot of these kind of cards have not seen any prominence. Thank you. Prominence. Thinking my own brain when I think of the word here. These cards we don't see them in decks because they're not good in decks because Nazgul decks did not exist. So we're gonna definitely find some cards that are just like what was the other one you found? The Mask of the Mimic is not a card that is good outside of this deck, right? So Mirror Mockery might be one of those cards, but I'm not sure. All right, moving on from clones, I have a few more that it's worth suggesting. Unearth. Unearth is just really good in this deck because it reanimates your Nazgul for 1 mana. That's really why it's there. I like the Feign Death effects, especially with sack outlets, but I also like one Unearth, one reanimation effect that can get any of your Nazgul because you have a lot of cards that require the first Nazgul in play, like clone effects or the Feign Deaths in your hand don't do anything if you don't have that first creature. And if a Nazgul is in the graveyard, this represents the first Nazgul. The fact that it cycles, as always, is just really good. If someone is playing Rest in Peace, cycle this away, move on with your life, and get the next card. Very, very good. The other one that's not here, and I think it should be here, is Unspeakable Symbol. So Unspeakable Symbol has this kind of reputation that it is a really, really strong card in like very hyper specific decks. And I do agree with that. And the thing I would say is be wary with it because its power is kind of nebulous. We'll use that word again. It's really hard to tell how much life you need to pay for this card to be good, and 3 life for an activation is not free. That being said, this is exactly the kind of deck this ability is really, really strong in because you don't need to activate it all the time. Remember earlier when we were talking about let's see, Plaguecrafter and Fleshbag Marauder, and how it's kind of difficult to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Well, the Unspeakable Symbol kind of is one of the solutions for that. It does skew the math, right? Because you now can't do it every turn forever. Eventually the life loss is going to stop you. But if you think about it, if you're paying 3 mana to for your opponents to sacrifice 3 creatures or any number of discard instead of creatures if they're out of creatures, I think that's a fair deal. I think I would pay 3 mana per turn to for each opponent to sacrifice their worst creature or discard their worst card in hand, especially if I could do it 3 or 4 turns in a row. And I think that's very, very good. The other reason this is good, obviously, as kind of a play it and forget it kind of idea. Actually, that's not the right phrase. Play it and keep it, keep it in your back pocket. Is cards like Baleful Strix get so much stronger with Unspeakable Symbol because there's just going to be situations that, Baleful Strix is going to trade, and then you're going to think, would I spend 3 life right now for an extra card and to keep a Baleful Strix? And you're just going to have to think about that, right? And I think sometimes the answer is going to be yes in the right setup, and you'll be happy to put a +1/+1 counter on the Baleful Strix. Likewise, you might think to yourself, Marchesa is in a situation she's going to die. Would I pay 3 life to keep her on the battlefield or have her return to the battlefield? And the answer is often yes, I would. 3 life is much better than 6 mana or 8 mana or whatever her command tax is at the moment, right? So you would definitely pay for that. So it's not a card that I would say just spam +1/+1 counters on everything, right? But it is something that's worth considering. So last card I want to suggest, I will put this here. I'm not going to suggest it anymore, but Cackling Counterpart was another card that was on my mind of just another clone effect that isn't at 4 mana. But it's probably the last clone effect. These kind of like token clone effects are probably the last ones I would play because they don't work with Marchesa. I just had it on the list, so I still want to mention it, but I don't recommend this. I will take a moment to say this art when I was playing Innistrad when I just started, this art confused me so much because I didn't realize that the counterpart, which is the one we're looking at right now, is facing away from us. I just looked at it, I was like, what? Like, I thought it was hiding its face with the hammer, which works really well because shapeshifters have this kind of like, don't look at me too closely element to them, especially in the horror style of Innistrad. Like, they're wearing your face, but they're not perfect. There's a lot of shapeshifters or, tokens or clones that have this kind of you can't really tell element to them. But then later I just realized, oh, it's just facing away from us and hiding a hammer behind its back. And I thought that was a little less fun. Thank you for indulging me on that moment. Slip Out the Back, I think, is the last card I'm going to suggest. Let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah, this has been a long video. I'm really happy with this deck, so I'm gonna end it here. But Slip Out the Back, for obvious reasons, protects your creatures, puts a +1/+1 counter on it. It does everything that you want, and I think you should at least consider the one of because honestly, this is really good both to protect Marchesa and put her counter on it, or to protect a creature when Marchesa leaves the battlefield. When you have a really big changeling outcast or winged hive tyrant that you want to keep in play because it is so powerful with your Nazgûl, and Marchesa's off the battlefield and it's being removed, Slip Out the Back. If you're being targeted with Swords to Plowshares and you don't have a sack outlet, Slip Out the Back. Very good card. As always, you can use this proactively and use it against your opponent's permanents should you need to fog them or there's going to be a combination that's going to win the game. Slip Out the Back is very effective at doing so. Just remember, you still need to deal with it on the next turn when when it faces back in. All right, I'm going to end this here. We're almost at like 50 minutes. We're almost at an hour. So I'm going to speed through this. If you have any more decks you'd like to submit, there is a link in the video description below. And if you have any other, if you'd like to bring that deck to the front of the list like Kybor did, there is also a link down there. Please like, subscribe, comment on the video. Always a big fan. This deck is so cool. Thank you so much, Kybor. I'm glad you were inspired by my words because your deck that was inspired by my words has inspired me. I like that kind of feedback loop we get with deck building and with this channel. So absolutely, thank you so much. This is so cool, and I think it's a lot of fun. All my suggestions are looking to kind of one lean more into the Nazgul play of things because I think the Nazgul are a lot of fun, and Otherwise, I want to, I'm realizing I didn't talk about card draw, so I'm going to be real quick on this. You can play Necropotence. With Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, Black Market Connections, you have a lot of good draw. You can play Read the Bones as an immediate kind of draw card, which this deck would benefit from instead of a turn after turn draw. But one copy of Necropotence will work really, really well here. It works with Dethrone. Necropotence is just generically good. You can overpay it to just draw a bunch of cards and exile the ones you don't want. Great card. You're in black. You can play it. You have good mana. Okay. Coming back, I think this deck is just fantastic. If there's one thing I would suggest, maybe more than I thought, is maybe Shadow Spear for Lifelink and Trample, because you will be paying a lot of life in this deck, and you do want to be topped off, and you have a lot of means to make good on that lifelink. That being said, the downside, of course, is then you can't use Dethrone, but if you're at 100 life and your opponents are at 10, you don't really mind. So, thank you so much, Kaibo, for this deck. This deck is so much fun. And I hope this inspires more people to build more Nazgul decks. But right now, in my mind, this is the Nazgul deck. Ah, oh, it's so cool. All right, good luck.